On June 2nd and 3rd, 2011, the Center for Design and Geopolitics held its first annual conference in La Jolla at Cal IT2, the California Institute of Telecommunications and Information Technology, on the campus of the University of California at San Diego. That was perfect, and also a perfect segue to the end of the day discussion, which will really be on the program of the Center for Design and Geopolitics. What its program is, what its programs can be, and how it would work, and I think this is already well framed for us. Our last contribution is from Manuel De Landa, who won't be joined us today. Manuel's work is familiar to many of you. He's one of the key philosophers of the 20th and 21st century, coming out of the continental tradition. His work on, particularly in relation to the work of Gilles Deleuze, and matching Deleuze's work with other questions, problematics, and techniques in contemporary science, has had already an enormous impact on a range of design disciplines, from architecture to urbanism to filmmaking. He's the author of numerous books: War in the Age of Intelligent Machines, which is a history of military technology told from the virtual perspective of a future artificial intelligence; 1,000 Years in Nonlinear History, which is a history of 1,000 years told from the tripartite of linguistics and geology as well. More recently, Deleuze and Intensive Science, and his most recent book is on simulations, as in computer simulations, and their role in this as well. So it's my pleasure to virtually welcome Manuel De Landa. Thank you. So what we want to do is turn the house lights down as far as we can go.
My fascination with geopolitics goes back a long time. I wrote my very first book on warfare partly because, as a materialist philosopher, I was intrigued with the space of the battlefield, a lethal space from which materiality cannot be exorcised. All those flying projectiles, all that fire, all those shockwaves, all those dismembered bodies cannot be ignored. But the battlefield itself was not the most important subject of that book. The geopolitical relations between countries at war was. Geopolitics forces us to think about countries in an embodied and spatially situated way. One way of thinking about Germany and Britain during World War II, for example, would be as abstract entities: German society, the British society. A geopolitical approach, on the other hand, makes us think about these countries as territorial entities, partly defined by their frontiers. Germany, for example, shared a frontier with two powerful countries, Russia and France, so whenever it wanted to declare war on one of them, it had to first sign a peace treaty with the other. Otherwise, as it moved its forces to one of its frontiers, it would leave undefended the other one, leaving itself open to attack. Great Britain, on its side, did not share a frontier with a powerful rival and was, of course, an island, a fact that allowed it to concentrate its resources on its navy and on strategies like naval blockades, strategies that are much less exhaustive and much cheaper than the occupation of an enemy's land. In subsequent publications, I began to wonder whether the geopolitical approach, in terms of embodied, spatially situated entities, could not be applied to other social wholes, to cities, for example, and the urban regions they structure, or to institutional organizations like hospitals, prisons, schools, barracks, factories, and the spaces they organize, or indeed to human communities and the neighborhoods or small towns that they inhabit. Before giving a geopolitical description of these smaller social entities, let me add that I'm aware that long-distance communication technologies can make these entities less dependent on a particular territory. A good example of this is a reliable postal service, like the ones that were already in service by the 17th century and which allowed the creation of dispersed scientific communities. Newer technologies, from the telephone to the internet, have created the possibility of dispersed interpersonal networks of friends living in different cities, or even of entirely virtual communities which are not spatially situated. Nevertheless, it can be argued that whether in the 17th century or today, dispersed communities coexist with communities that live within well-specified spatial boundaries. Let's begin then with the simplest case, that of a tightly knit community inhabiting a small town or an ethnic neighborhood. In a tightly knit community, everybody knows everybody else, and this means that word of mouth, hearsay, gossip travels really fast, particularly when the subject of the conversation is the violation of a local norm, an unkept promise, an unreciprocated favor, an unpaid debt, a lie. Because knowledge of any dishonored commitment becomes collected relatively fast, the community as a whole can be said to have the capacity to store reputations. In addition to this, in a community in which everyone lives next to one another as neighbors and in which they depend on one another to make a living, simple forms of punishment like ridicule or ostracism can serve to enforce local norms. It is important to emphasize that it is the community as a whole that has the capacity to enforce local norms and the capacity to store reputations. It does not really matter what member of the community is the one who spotted a dishonored commitment. It does not really matter what members of the community are the ones who laugh behind someone else's back. And it does not really matter what members of the community are the ones who refuse to interact with a violator. As long as a critical mass of community members engages in ridicule and ostracism, their personal identities do not really matter. And it is for this reason that a community can be considered an embodied social whole. That is a social whole that has its own capacities to affect and capacities to be affected. The next step is to situate communities in space relative to other communities. This can be done by considering, for instance, several small towns, each perhaps housing a different religious community, or several neighborhoods adjacent to one another within the same city, each one housing a different ethnic community. In the absence of conflict, the borders between communities may be quite porous. Personal friendship networks, for example, may extend across the borders, and intermarriage between members of communities may be quite common. But in the presence of conflict, whether religious, ethnic, or otherwise, things change. The borders of communities harden, the distinctions between us and them become more prominent, the physical borders of neighborhoods or towns are now defended by gangs, and perhaps more importantly, the members of the communities begin to police each other with higher intensity. Whereas before conflict, being a Jew, a Christian, or a Muslim within one's community may be unproblematic, after conflict begins, our behavior is watched much more closely by other members of the community to see if one is a true Christian, a true Muslim, a true Jew. We can conclude from this that we can speak of a geopolitics at the level of communities without metaphor. A similar point applies to institutional organizations, whether these are government organizations, religious organizations, commercial, financial, and industrial organizations, medical organizations, educational organizations. In many cases, these organizations have an authority structure, that is, a hierarchical arrangement of people in which commands flow downwards and reports about the fulfillment of those commands or the performance of the commanded actions flow upwards in the hierarchy. To make sure that commands are followed in the day-to-day operations of an organization, the authority structure must have legitimacy. This legitimacy may be derived from a tradition, as in religious organizations. It may be derived from the charisma of the leader, as in sects, or it may be derived from the capacities to get things done, as in a bureaucratic organization. But whatever the sources of legitimacy, every command given by someone in a position of authority must be seen as legitimate by those who are supposed to follow it. In the case of private organizations, like hospitals, schools, or factories, the spatial limits of authority tend to coincide with the physical limits of the building that houses the organization. But in the case of government organizations, the spatial extent of their authority coincides with their jurisdiction. In the case of the United States, for example, the jurisdiction of the FBI extends to the entire country, that of state police extends only to the borders of their states, and that of local police departments to the boundaries of their cities. The existence of overlapping jurisdiction already points to a possible source of conflict. Who is in charge for investigating or persecuting a particular crime? Unlike the United States, however, where jurisdictional disputes can be solved by simply consulting the Constitution, there are many countries in which the central government and all the different local governments are founded upon entirely different principles of legitimacy, and in these cases jurisdictional disputes become properly geopolitical. Conflict between private sector organizations can arise for a variety of reasons. One of them is the extent of the intellectual authority of the products produced by these organizations. A good example would be the books produced by a scientific academy versus the books produced by the church. The confrontation in the United States between creationists and Darwinists over who gets to have authority over what is taught in schools is a good example of geopolitics at the level of private sector organization. A very different example would be strategic interactions between members of an oligopoly, that is, a financial, commercial, or industrial sector dominated by a handful of companies. Oligopolistic competition is very different than the anonymous competition discussed by Adam Smith. In particular, the existence of only a few firms means that members of an oligopoly can take each other's responses into account when making decisions. The typical object of oligopolistic rivalry is market share. In some industries, such as the railroad industry in America in the 19th century and in many electrical utilities in the 20th, market share has a strong territorial component. In these cases, it is not hard to apply traditional geopolitical thinking to battles for market share. But in most industries, market share is more diffused and lacks any correlation with spatial features. Before the advent of international corporations, however, even these dispersed forms of market share had at least one link to space. Their brands tended to be national, and only a few ones crossed national borders. Today, of course, national borders are not an obstacle to global brands, so it may be argued that the battle for market share is not spatially situated anymore. The question is then, has globalization eliminated the geopolitical dimension from oligopolistic rivalry? The answer is a qualified no, because globalization itself has been sustained by other social entities that do have a strong relation to space. Cities. We can make a rough distinction between landlocked cities, many of them acting as regional capitals in control of large urban regions, and maritime metropolises, less tied to their territory and oriented outward toward faraway land to which they are connected by the sea. Examples of the first type of city are Paris, Vienna, Madrid, Berlin, Washington, and Peking. Examples of the second type are Venice, Genoa, Antwerp, Amsterdam, New York, Shanghai. Landlocked cities, in concert with smaller towns in the same region, tend to develop a strong cultural identity by attracting migratory flows of cultural producers from all around the region and then slowly distilling their contributions into a coherent regional culture. That is, a culture closely tied to a territory. Neighboring regions, therefore, can develop cultural rivalries with each other, manifested in practices as different as the regional dialect, cuisine, or more recently, their sport teams. Maritime metropolises, on the other hand, do not tend to develop a cultural identity linked to space because they act as gateways to foreign cultures, housing communities of foreigners that come to the city to trade. Moreover, the cities form closer links to one another as they form dispersed networks of trading ports and had little allegiance to the territories to which they formerly belonged. When large kingdoms, empires, and nation-states began to assert themselves and win wars against the older city-states, some landlocked cities became national capitals and were used as instruments to subjugate all other cities to a central state. But the maritime metropolises continue to exist alongside their landlocked counterparts and to control commercial and financial flows that cross national boundaries. A perfect example of the detachment from territorial constraints of the nodes of this network is Amsterdam in the 1600s. The 17th century witnessed one of the most horrific wars prior to the world wars in our own era. The 30 Years' War, pitting the Habsburg Empire against France and Sweden, among others. Amsterdam, despite the fact that it was nominally a part of one of the two warring factions, was selling weapons to both sides, almost as if it floated above the landlocked entities caught in the conflict. But more importantly, By that time, Amsterdam was already the dominant node in a network of ports that spanned the entire globe, a fact that would push the origin of commercial globalization 3 centuries back. When London became the dominant node in the 18th and 19th centuries, it promoted the globalization of finance. The laying of telegraphic cable across the Atlantic in the late 1800s could have consolidated this global push, but the First World War intervened, delaying the process by several decades. Industrial globalization, of course, is a much more recent phenomenon, since it had to wait for the advent of computers to create efficient supply chains extending across many countries. Nevertheless, even today, the process of globalization and its almost complete detachment from spatial constraints is underpinned by a network of maritime metropolises that, however free from the lock of the land, have a very definite relationship to geography. To conclude, geopolitics continues to be relevant today, and not only at the scale of nation-states. Many communities, organizations, and cities continue to have an intimate relationship with their territories and with their natural resources. But a new layer of social entities has been superimposed on them, one containing dispersed networks of friends living across the planet and linked through telephones and email, entirely virtual communities in which the members know each other despite the fact that they have never met in person, that is, despite the fact that they have never occupied the same space, and virtual organizations, like the different projects belonging to the open source movement, in which different solutions to the problem of creating authority structures have been devised. While it is important to recognize the existence of these new entities and of the changes in geopolitical thinking they may bring about, it is also important not to forget that they fully coexist with their more territorialized counterparts. Ignoring the latter is like forgetting the link between distance-defying global processes and the very concrete network of cities that have made them possible. Thank you very much.